Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 1st of April, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. I'm back this week. This is not an April Fool's Day prank, but happy April Fool's Day to everyone. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway with Robert, starting with the Fifth Circuit Court judge. He's, I guess, opining on these inferior courts. What's going on?
Good morning, Mike. Yes, this is Fifth Circuit Court Judge James Ho, who's a Trump appointee from his previous administration. And he said that the federal appeals courts need to be ready to step in because he says these district courts are potentially refusing to stay in their lane. And he said there's actually a unique danger that some of these district courts could undermine the faith, Americans' faith in the courts. And I did see some Rasmussen polling recently where they found 57% of Americans polled thought that we are in the middle of a constitutional crisis over these legal cases. And Ho pointed out something interesting. He said that legal elites are imposing a double standard on judicial independence, and he said that this could be fatal to the rule of law in the United States.
So, where's this headed? I'm guessing the Supreme Court. Is there any indication they're going to get to it, like maybe before the midterms?
Well, we covered yesterday that in one of these cases, the Supreme Court actually gave a deadline of today for the plaintiffs, people suing the Trump administration, to respond to the government saying that their case should be dismissed. And I believe that is in the Alien Enemies Act case.
Mm-hmm.
So they are getting to it. In some of these cases, it looks like they're starting to actually respond to these emergency petitions from the Trump administration.
Okay. What about a Supreme Court? How are they? I guess, Robert, I'm asking, how does this end? Is the Supreme Court going to tell the lower courts to stop, or what? How does this end?
Right now, at least 4 of the justices have already said that these courts need to knock it off. Right, all they really need is Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, or the Chief Justice Roberts to side with them to get these courts to knock it off. And I think Roberts also probably sees this as potentially undermining Americans' faith in the court system if these district courts can just can just basically one federal judge out of 1,000 can just completely stop the White House from doing anything.
Certainly. All right. Thanks, Robert, for staying on top of that. Let's move over to California. What's going on?
So this is out of the California Federal District Court in San Francisco, and Edward Chin, who's the judge there, he blocked the Trump administration from ending temporary protected status for 350,000 Venezuelan nationals. And he said that this is because the Trump administration failed to identify any real harm from continuing the TPS program, and then obviously said that this applied nationally. This is, again, another case where we're seeing these federal district judges saying that the Trump administration cannot reverse executive orders applied from a previous administration. This was something that happened pretty regularly during Trump's first administration. And I think now that we're in the second Trump administration with the Supreme Court on the lookout for this, falling U.S. or American faith in the courts, I think this is another case that the Supreme Court's going to take up. And I think that they could actually go for the Trump administration in this case and probably not do what they have done in the past, where they said, the Trump administration didn't follow the correct procedures, even though they took a constitutional action.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then let's end up in the Senate, because I guess Republican senators are trying to figure out this debt ceiling deal. And Senator Cory Booker, a Democrat from, I believe, New Jersey, is filibustering the Senate. What's going on?
Yeah, Cory Booker is still, as far as I've seen it, still filibustering. He's doing what's called a talking filibuster. So in the Senate, there's 2 different kinds. There's a legislative filibuster that requires 60 votes to pass a bill, and then there's an actual traditional filibuster. And Booker said that he intends to disrupt the normal business in the Senate, and he's prepared to continue to do today. And I think this is a new strategy from Senate Democrats to disrupt the Trump administration's agenda, because they're trying to do this, and they're also trying to force a vote to block Trump's tariffs through an Emergency Powers Act, through a Senate resolution. And I think if Booker is perceived to be successful in this filibuster, we'll see more of these Senate Democrats do the same thing as the Senate and House head into this debt ceiling fight.
Mm-hmm. All right, Robert. Again, thanks for staying on that. Let's go through these roll up items, and Robert, I'll just hand it over to you.
So we talked about these special elections yesterday. Well, they're scheduled for today, and this is 2 seats in Florida and then the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And I think Democrats are unlikely to win or unlikely to flip those 2 House seats in Florida, but they're going to try to use the momentum where they're, I think, likely to do better in this special election than they did in 2024 in these seats, to say that Democrats are staging a comeback. And I think Elon Musk's money in this Wisconsin Supreme Court could be a decisive factor. And looks what I saw in polling and fundraising, it is very tight. So this is actually going to be very important for the 2026 election, because the Supreme Court in Wisconsin is going to determine how 2026 seats are appropriated throughout the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk that this redistricting process, if the Democrat judge does win, the Supreme Court will redistrict, create 2 new seats, and then potentially flip the House.
Yeah, and this is something that Democrats were doing ahead of the 2024 election in some of the states down here, where they put out maps where they effectively created new seats that were 99% going to Democrats.
Mm-hmm. I would also point out that a number of these left-wing political action groups and Democrat strategists talked about the importance of winning the state houses, because the state houses control the legislation over the 2028 general election, the next presidential election. And if the Democrat judge does win and you have a Wisconsin Supreme Court that's run by Democrats, I guess, Robert, any potential challenges at the state level decided by pro-Democrat Supreme Court as well?
Yeah, that would, just like every general election, there's always challenges, and I think they could be deciding, because Wisconsin is one of those battleground states, and they could end up deciding if whoever's projected to win in 2028, they could decide on the challenges to that and determine who wins that battleground state.
Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that be something? All right, let's move on to the next Trump lawsuit.
Yeah, this is a lawsuit in response to that election executive order issued last week, and this is actually from the Democratic National Committee and a group of nonprofits. And they're saying that this executive order that requires documentary proof of citizenship and enforces a uniform election day is unconstitutional and actually tramples on state authority to run elections. I think they're correct in that statement, but the method that the executive order uses has been used, very commonly by the federal government. They're not saying these states have to implement these policies. They're just saying if they don't, that they will lose some federal funds. Mm-hmm. And then the nursing home industry is warning that projected Medicaid cuts in this budget reconciliation bill that the GOP is trying to pass could actually be a crisis for nursing homes. And they're saying that they could see closures as 8 million baby boomers are set to reach the 80 and older population group by 2035. And I think this highlights 2 issues. One, we have a major aging population that is going to significantly increase some of these entitlement spending that Ray Dalio has warned about, and that the House or the GOP and the Trump administration are concerned about this ballooning deficit spending. But at the same time, cutting Medicaid is, I think, a major political catalyst for domestic unrest, especially with worsening potential economic crisis. Mm-hmm. And then the ag industry lobbyist group Fertilizer Institute said the Trump administration trying to increase domestic production of potash for fertilizer is not going to cover all the needs of U.S. farmers. And according to their data, they said that U.S. production covers only 1% of demand, and 90% of demand is imported from Canada, 90% of potash. I did see and I think we talked about it a couple of months ago when the Trump administration proposed it. There is in Michigan a potash deposit that the Trump administration is trying to get companies to exploit, but they said they're not going to be able to cover they're only going to be able to cover about 10% of U.S. demand, and by I think 2028. So they were still heavily dependent on these fertilizer imports for the agricultural industry.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on over to Jared for the global roll-up. Jared.
Absolutely. We're going to start off in Europe. So, German politicians, one in their national government and one in the European government, are both calling for an audit of Germany's about 1,300 tons worth of gold over in the New York Federal Reserve. And the reason they're doing this is their stated reason is that they don't trust the Trump administration. Now, the Bundesbank president, which is the German central bank, says that he maintains that the New York Fed is reliable and trustworthy, and he expects the gold to be there. So he's trying to put a bit of a tamper on it. But this would actually not be the first time that Germany has attempted to audit the Federal Reserve. There was a previous attempt in 2012 under Obama. So I don't think it's going to immediately yield results, but I think this is part of a larger trend of lack of at least European trust in the Trump administration, and we could see this maybe balloon up into additional issues, specifically around American credibility. Going right next door over to France, a French court convicted the French presidential candidate Marine Le Pen of embezzlement, and this is going to prevent her from seeking public office for 5 years, thereby preventing her from participating in the 2027 presidential election there. Now, President Trump spoke out on this, saying that this is effectively the same thing that the Democrats tried to do against him in 2024. So I think that this also plays into a very similar trend that we're seeing with the gold there from Germany, is that it seems like Europe is trying to get back at Trump for being the American leader here. Now, we've seen this in France, Germany with AfD and Musk's endorsement, and Romania with Karlin Georgescu. I think all of this is trying to secure their power, but at the same time trying to stick it to Trump in small democratic ways or diplomatic ways that he would not be able to necessarily step in on without looking like he's interfering with democracy.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to Iran, because we have this massive deployment of strategic bombers and other aircraft to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean within striking distance of Iran. Oh, and Trump last week said, kind of obliquely threatened Iran, and now Iran's coming out and saying that they are going to start building, or I guess they are going to build a nuclear weapon if they get bombed here. So what's going on?
Yes, this is coming from a senior advisor to the Ayatollah. He's saying that they would be compelled toward producing an atomic bomb if Israel or the United States bombed Iran, specifically for developing a nuclear weapon. So they're giving themselves a lot of outs here, but nevertheless, the threat remains that, hey, we will move toward this if you guys bomb us. I have seen some people talking about them or Iran potentially striking Diego Garcia, but I don't think that's likely because they're 2,400 miles from that. It's quite the distance. There's going to be some warning. Mm-hmm. Then moving much closer to home, over in Canada, several Canadian academics that are writing for an outlet that's partially government funded by the Canadian government said that a friendly U.S.-Canada merger could actually benefit Canada by shifting America leftward and creating a larger economy. Normally, I wouldn't have paid too much attention to this, except that it is partially government funded, and these people actually tend to write in publications that do influence government policy. So I think there's going to be some consideration on maybe taking Trump up on the offer. I don't think it's going to have too many legs.
Canada's not going to do that. There's no way.
Okay. I'm saying,
Jared, this sounds to me like some Canadian liberals just, trying to show that if Canada were annexed, it would create a bunch of new Senate and House seats, and it would just basically put a bunch of more leftists in government. So I think that's about all it is. All right. Thanks, Jared. We'll bring you back here in just a second. Let's go ahead and move to today's low intensity conflict. So, Rep, just one item today. There is a large protest, which this may be the largest protest we have seen since 2020, coming up this Saturday on the 5th of April. This is being organized by Indivisible, which is probably the largest anti-Trump protest group in the country. And this thing is called Hands Off. It's going to be in Washington, D.C., in addition to somewhere between 700 and 1,000 other locations throughout the country. And they're hoping to draw 1 million protesters. And they're pretty adamant that this thing has to be big, and they've got to continue building momentum, and that if there's lower turnout here for this protest, then they'll essentially be going backwards. That's what I got from it. There's a recent email from Indivisible telling readers that President Trump and senior advisor Elon Musk are planning a crackdown on peaceful protesters. And they say that this protest needs to be large, quote, to show that the opposition to this regime is massive and that it's growing. So, again, I think this could be the largest since 2020, just in terms of protests. I do expect these to be actually peaceful, not mostly peaceful. But these protests previously many of them have remained very small, from the single digits to under 100, under 50. So I remain skeptical that organizers are going to be able to hit 1 million protesters on Saturday. I'd say 500,000 potentially. I mean, we can even look at the Inauguration Day protests in DC. Quite small considering all the buildup that was going into it. So we'll see. I think this is a barometer event. If they hit 1 million, I think it will be quite significant. I don't expect them to hit 1 million, but I'll continue to look at what groups are pushing to show up in DC. Organizing activities, again, have been pretty underwhelming. They have not rivaled the volume and intensity seen between 2017 and 2020. I think the left is still struggling to get back to 2017 levels, obviously far short of 2020. And so that remains the high watermark for civil unrest. But I do actually see this Trump Resistance 2.0 movement growing. I am seeing some organizing success. And we've also seen some sporadic violence, especially at these Tesla dealerships. So overall, I see the left trying to get back to 2017 levels. We'll see. They've got a ways to go. And by the way, someone yesterday on Twitter said that we are in the middle of a color revolution. And, I did this hour and a half long presentation on color revolutions. I'll dig that video up and we'll drop it back on this channel. But we may be in the first or second inning of an attempted color revolution. I think this is what they're pushing towards eventually, or at least trying to build the capacity to launch some form of popular revolution against the Trump administration. We're not in the middle of the game. We're in the first inning, probably, maybe second inning. And I still think Democrats are gunning towards being able to flip the House and or the Senate in the 26 midterms. I don't see a popular revolution happening before then, frankly. Just doesn't make sense from their perspective. All right. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. We have these reciprocal tariffs coming tomorrow, Robert. And I'll tell you, there's a huge amount of interest on pharmaceuticals. What is going to happen to the American drug supply? The U.S. is the most heavily medicated country on earth. What do you see happening?
Well, there's not been a lot of details yet on what exact tariffs are going to be unveiled, except for the reciprocal tariffs, because Trump has talked about specifically targeting the pharmaceutical industry, which is heavily dependent on this overseas production. And Scott Bessent did hint that a lot of the tariffs are going to focus on what he called the Dirty 15. And those are the top 15 U.S. trade partners with trade deficits. And 9 of those are in Asia, where these pharmaceutical supply chains are. So I think targeting these countries would likely have a major impact on these key supply chains for pharmaceuticals. And, there has been some pushback on the tariffs and, a talk from some industry groups saying that they were going to file suit over them. But I think the Trump administration will likely win that court fight, because the courts have declined really to weigh in on emergency powers for tariffs. And I think what would actually require them to end tariffs if we do see a major impact on pharmaceutical supply chains is a joint resolution from Congress, which I think is unlikely to pass with a veto-proof majority.
Mm-hmm. So what is it going to take to get these pharmaceutical companies to move production back to the States? Because this is what these Trump tariffs are intended to do. Take all this foreign business, move it into the United States. It is a huge national security risk that India and China produce most of our life-saving drugs. Any indication on if these tariffs are going to be successful, or further action is going to be required?
Well, I think that just depends on what the percentage of the tariff is, because the way to get these pharmaceutical companies to move back to the U.S. is to make it profitable to produce these drugs in the United States. And that requires the price of imports to be above basically the profit margin they could get out of domestic production. So I think that depends on what percentage of a tariff Trump is actually planning to levy on these pharmaceutical supply chains.
All right. Any other words on this reciprocal tariffs?
Well, I did see some other, I think Goldman Sachs said that they're expecting, some moves from the Fed now because of these tariffs, the impact from these tariffs. And there's also stuff coming out of the Dallas and Philadelphia Federal Reserve surveys saying that basically U.S. businesses are paralyzed because they're waiting for, some certainty around how these tariffs are going to be implemented, which is probably one of the most disruptive factors from Trump's tariffs actions, is that there's a lot of uncertainty because he will implement tariffs and then back off, or he'll say he will and then back off because deals are being made and then implement them again. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around these. And I think that's really going to have a major impact on some of these key supply chains that we're dependent on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then just speaking about economic instability, that was one of the things I noticed last week as well. I put in the weekly economic outlook that came out for early warning members on Friday. There's a great amount of difficulty for these investment banks to opine on what the economy is actually doing. There's mixed economic data, but I mean, essentially all these financial analysts and economists are saying, we actually can't tell you exactly where the economy is going because we can't determine what these tariffs are going to look like in another 90 or 180 days. And so it seems like, maybe Trump is in the driver's seat on this. If some of these reciprocal tariffs are reversed because we have a new trade deal, then, maybe this economic picture will become a lot more clear and, maybe look a little better than it is. Thanks for that, Robert. And then let's move on here to Taiwan. Huge news. It seems to me, huge news. China has this blockade drill happening around Taiwan. Jared, is this more smoke or more fire?
I think we're starting to see some embers, quite frankly. Just that this seems like a lot more than smoke to me. So this is coming from the Eastern Theater Command over in China. That's the ETC there. They did not name the drills, which is a difference from how this normally runs. Normally there's at least an internal name. And the ETC said that they would be focused on combat readiness patrols, imposing a blockade, comprehensive control, and striking maritime and land targets. All of that is running a blockade with the supporting military infrastructure there. So coming out and saying that is actually quite unusual for the Chinese. Normally you can just kind of tell by their actions. In addition, the Chinese Taiwan Affairs Office said that this is for their rampant independence provocations, which we've touched on a ton here just this year. Mm-hmm. The Taiwanese believe that this is actually a response to Defense Secretary Hegseth's tour of Asia that just wrapped up because it started the day after he left. Now, in another change from the norm, the ETC released a bunch of propaganda videos with it, which by itself is fairly normal, but what they did in them is different. This is a still from one of them where they are roasting the Taiwanese president over a fire set on Taiwan. In it, they repeatedly referred to him as a parasite and described all the things that they were saying that he was doing to Taiwan, including hollowing it out and infecting it with disease. And another actually depicted a Chinese mythological figure, and the entire video was in leading the invasion into Taiwan, and it was entitled "Subdue Demons and Vanquish Evils." Normally, China doesn't go to this length for how it demonizes, pardon the pun, its opposition. It normally uses separatist or breaking national unity, stuff like that. I think this is actually meant to mentally prepare the Chinese for a war against Taiwan, because you do have to demonize your enemy. Additionally, the drill is lacking a name. That is very odd. I think this is supposed to introduce ambiguity into what they're doing going further, and we'll likely see a lack of names going forward, except for major ones like Joint Sword. We covered Joint Sword last year. That had 2 iterations for the first time, but they actually do run that fairly frequently. Mm-hmm. And this is going to complicate planning for Taiwan and its Pacific allies. And I think what that's going to do is actually drive I think it's going to really cause a lot of the Pacific allies to increase or to speed up their plans to forward position assets. So we've talked about Typhon and the unmanned surface vessels being moved to the Philippines. I think that's going to happen much quicker, because if you don't know when exactly one of these drills is going to shift from a drill into a proper blockade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the big fear from Taiwanese leaders. I know you've covered this many times. Jared, we do have some audience questions. I will get to them in just a second. But my last question for you is China actually demonstrating the capability and the capacity to launch a blockade against Taiwan in these drills?
I think they are. I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is that most of this is going to have to be one of the largest. We've seen them run larger drills already. This is not one of their largest drills.
Mm.
I think what we're going to have to see is a true mass movement where they mobilize basically everything to conduct this, because we've covered previously what the premier amphibious assault force thought it would take to do this, and China's not anywhere near the force capability that it's projected, let alone it would actually need.
Okay. All right. That is very valuable insight. Jared, thanks for staying on top of this. And with that, we do have some questions. We'll get to a few here. Jared, first question up for you. Is there any way to report of a third carrier strike group heading to the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, or that general area of responsibility?
I saw that the Carl Vinson strike group is heading there. We covered that yesterday. I think they're just going to replace the Truman, because the Truman, even though they fixed the damage from that collision, they will still need a replacement. It may also be to replace Chowda Hill, because he's now doing back-to-back deployments there. I don't think there is an East Coast carrier ready to deploy yet. And I do think we will see a mobilization probably while the two are while the Truman and Vinson are in the Middle East, just so that you can relieve the Vinson, have the Vinson go back to the Pacific where it's supposed to be. But yeah, we covered yesterday that there's a lot of movement of the carriers right now to cover down, and I think we'll see 3 assigned, but then shifting all of those out.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Robert, next question to you. Or excuse me, I guess this is back to Jared. This talk of a U.S.-Canada merger. Listen, I've seen Peter Zion and some other people say that eventually, there's going to be like a North American supercontinent. And I know there's this talk about Fortress North America, basically the United States taking Greenland and acquiring or annexing Canada at some level. Trump has 3.5 years left, something like that. And that's a lot of movement for 3.5 years. I mean, literally nobody was talking about Canada becoming a part of the United States prior to Donald Trump talking about Greenland, Canada. And I just think that's way too rapid. Even if there was a significant amount of support in Canada, I still think a matter of years is way too short a timeline. But Robert, Jared, these threats from Trump and the joking about the Canadian governor and
Mike froze. Mike, I'm not sure where you were going to go with that, but Scott, just to answer the question, I don't think it is a tell you what you're going to do kind of thing. I think what it is that I think they'll try to explore the possibility and then just take what they can that would benefit Canada the most without actually having to concede their territory. Gonna pull Mike off here. Robert, we'll move on to the next question until Mike comes back.
Yeah, I think that was from Bad Wabbit saying, but feds have control of federal elections. Actually, no, the states actually have control over the running of federal and state level elections. So that's the contention here in this lawsuit, is that the Trump administration is interfering with the constitutional powers of the state to run these elections. All right. Let's see. The next one from Elwindor. Could capital controls be implemented by the government to stop money fleeing from the country if things go pear-shaped? I think that there are already generally restrictions on moving cash out of the country, like people are stopped constantly and civil asset forfeiture is used to stop people from moving large amounts of cash.
Yeah, sorry, I cut out there, so I didn't catch the rest of that. Could capital controls implemented by the government to stop money fleeing the country? You're talking about in the United States, I guess. I mean, yeah, they could be implemented. I've seen a number of people say eventually that will happen if there is a rush to the exits. But look, the US dollar is still one of the strongest currencies in the world. It is still considered a safe haven. The US, this stuff that's the instability in US markets, equity markets, eventually going to work itself out. I still think foreign demand for US treasuries is still fairly strong because they're the most liquid place to put your money. So I think a lot of the talk about the US fiscal situation is dire, and long term it is definitely unsustainable. In the near term, it goes back to the saying, yeah, the dollar's the worst currency in the world except for all the rest. And I think there's truth to that for US markets and US treasuries as well. And sorry, Robert, I didn't catch your answer, but we'll do the last question here. Robert, have you seen anything on this? I have not. Is there any speculation on the FBI raiding some university professor's home and I guess at Indiana University? Have you seen anything like that?
I haven't seen any coverage of that. I do know that the Trump administration has been quietly targeting some of these foreign students, that are hero student visas, especially ones that are involved with protests on campus, like the pro-Palestine stuff. Mm. But if the FBI is getting involved, then that's obviously not something to do with, cracking down on these protests. And this could be something to do with espionage related, because it's something that's very common in universities, especially research universities.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Robert, thanks for that. Everyone, that's going to do it for our morning briefing. Thanks so much for your support. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show, starting at 08 Central Time. Everyone, it is April Fool's Day. Don't get fooled. Until next time, be well. Let's stay out front.